If you've been making music for any length of time, then you've probably heard people talking about saturation and how it can do some pretty amazing things. But if you're anything like me when I started making music, you might not know exactly what saturation is or how to actually use it to make your music sound better. That's what I'm going to go over in this video. Firstly, I'll give you a quick run through of what saturation is, how it works, and what it's actually doing to your audio signals. And secondly, I'll be making a beat from scratch, showing you practical examples of how you can use saturation to make your music production sound better throughout the entire music making process. And I'm going to share with you my own personal workflow, which uses saturation to optimize your music to be as loud, smooth, and polished as it can be. Sounds good? Well, let's get started. So, what is saturation in simple terms? Saturation is a type of harmonic distortion, which historically comes from overloading the physical analog circuitry of analog gear. And in the digital realm, which is what we'll be covering today, it is usually done by plugins which are modeling the characteristics of those analog circuits. So why does saturation sound so good to our ears? Saturation brings out increased harmonics. Harmonics are a type of overtone that sounds pleasing to the human ear because they relate to the original note that was played. And with saturation, those overtones get amplified. So if we're going to have a look at this in practice and see what saturation is actually doing to our audio signal, I've got a pure sine wave here, which sounds like this. Now, I've got this saturation plugin put onto the maximum amount of drive. I'm just going to crank it up. This is with 0 saturation, and you can see as soon as I start to crank that up, the frequency spectrum is changing. As I lower it down, those frequencies are exiting the frequency spectrum. So, saturation is essentially creating new signal that wasn't previously present. It's thickening up the sound. It's actually taking a sound and expanding it further up the frequency spectrum. It's creating something that wasn't otherwise there, or at least wasn't otherwise audible to our human hearing. Now, this will also apply on multiple notes, and it will create harmonics for each note that is played. So if I play an A minor chord here, you'll see it's creating a lot of harmonics. Right, with that brief explanation out of the way, let's actually get to the part you're interested in. How to use saturation to make your music sound louder, better, and more polished. I'm feeling like making some sort of Bruno Mars, Silk Sonic 70s inspired kind of vibe today, so that's what we're going to go for, and it's the perfect way to illustrate how to use saturation throughout the process, because there's plenty of different elements and plenty of stuff that needs gluing together in the mix. So, I've pulled up this piano sound for now. Sounds a little bit like this, and we'll try and get some chords in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we've got these jazzy chords. Now let's treat them up. And the very first thing I'm going to start with is some tape saturation, specifically from a plugin called Needlepoint. Now this simulates playing something through an old school like record player, tape deck. You can get some of that tape noise and crackle to go with your saturation, and that helps glue things together even more. So let's try that out. Okay, so that's sounding great. We're now going to get some EQ on there and take off a little bit of the top end. And notice how on the EQ you can already see that saturation being added. Next we're going to lean into that tape saturation even more using this Studer A800 tape plugin that mimics an old school tape recorder, and there's plenty of free options of these available as well. Okay, so we've got a few saturation plugins on there already, so let's listen to the difference without those and with them. So without them it sounds like this. And with them, now you can see it's just taking some top end off, bringing the energy down a bit and bringing it all closer together and making it more cohesive. So it's much more easy to fit that into a track. And you'll notice I took a bit of high end off there with this EQ here, and that also helps give you that tape old school saturation vibe, because when you recorded to tape back in the day, it naturally reduced the high frequencies a little bit as just part of the process. So we've got those. Let's move on to the next stage. Okay, so the next thing we're going to add is a Rhodes electric piano kind of vibe, just to accent that first piano layer. So let's get something in. That's nice. That's really nice. Okay, so we got a lovely, lovely sounding Rhodes there. Now, we are gonna give this some saturation to glue it together and get it into the mix. So we're just gonna use this oven plugin to add some nice warmth and depth to this Rhodes. A bit of sparkle on the top end. And we're going to just turn the mix down a little bit here. And you can just feel that giving a little bit of extra punch. And we can now turn this down a bit in the mix. So this is the first stage of the saturation workflow, where we're getting most of our elements and we're just giving them a little bit of saturation. We're not distorting them loads or blowing them out. We're just giving them that little touch that gets them a bit more cohesive, a bit more glued together, and just more easy to slot into the mix. And crucially, it makes them louder with less crest factor. Now, crest factor is really important. It's the difference between the average level and the top peaks. And by adding saturation, we're taking up the average level to make it closer to the peaks. So your overall signal has less dynamic range, which is, when you're getting a loud mix, quite a good thing sometimes. So doing this at the very initial stage is super helpful, and I recommend you guys to try it out in your own productions. So we've got this Rhodes sounding really nice. I think it could also do with a little bit of compression, so let's get that on there. Just a nice LA2A to tame those peaks a little bit. So now I'm just adding a little bit of compression to the piano, and you'll notice that using analog gear or plugins that model analog gear often adds their own saturation, even if they're not saturation plugins. So for instance, this compressor is adding a little bit of saturation. If we go to the Rhodes here, this LA2A is also adding its own little bit of tube saturation. So by stacking things up in small increments, you can get to a great result without overdoing any one specific plugin. And when you're working with plugins, a lot of the time, if you really do take it far and crank it, that's when the plugins kind of start to break up and lose a bit of their clarity versus maybe some analog hardware that can sound better sometimes. So next up, and a great culprit for saturation, we are going to do some drums. Okay, so we got a basic drum groove in, and it sounds a bit like this. Now, how are we going to use saturation to make this sound better? Well, we've got two ways. Firstly, we're going to do some saturation on individual elements to get them a bit more cohesive. And secondly, I'm going to show you how to do some parallel processing, which is really useful if you want to preserve the transients, that's the loudest part of the sound, but still bring the general level up and make it sound more punchy. So let's do the first part, which is some individual saturation on the elements. Now I want this snare to sound a little bit thicker, but not actually raise the volume of it too much. So let's put some decapitator on there. So we've put a little bit of decapitator on here, and let's have a listen. This is with, and this is without. So you can just hear it's just thickening up, adding a little bit of body to that snare, which helps it sit well in the mix. But if you notice, the peak meter isn't really changing. That's because the saturation is adding harmonics along it and making it sound thicker, but it's not increasing the peak level. In fact, it's shaving off a little bit of the peaks. So you're getting a louder sound and you're less likely to get clipping. So it's really good for making drums punch through and still keep the volume at a healthy level. Now, we're going to do a trick I talked a little bit about earlier on the kick, which is we're going to compress it, and we're going to use the compression circuit to add in a little bit of extra saturation as well. So you can see here, we're doing a few dB of compression, and we're also loading up the saturation circuit. You can see I've got the output pretty high level here. And again, we're peaking at around the same level, but the kick sounds much louder. See, we're peaking at a very similar level, and the kick is much more noticeable and present in the mix. So next up, we'll do some parallel processing. So to do this, very easy, we're going to create a separate effects channel, add an effects channel here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to send our drum tracks over to here, nice and easy like this. And then we are going to get a saturation plugin of our choosing. Let's try FabFilter's Saturn and dial in some nice saturation. So you can hear with this fab filter Saturn on here and these drums sent about a third of the way up there, it sounds super beefy and fat. Without that, and with it, oh, huge difference. And you'll notice that the transients, i.e. the attack of the kick and the snare and the hats, are all still intact, and it's actually just bringing up the remainder of the sound to create a nice even kind of level, which is great. And that is sounding lovely. Next up, we can get some bass in there, and on the bass, we're going to try out a little advanced tip, which is multiband saturation, to bring out just certain parts of the sound. So this is going to be pretty cool. Let's get started. 1, 2, 3, 4. We played one wrong note, but we can correct it and we will be good to go. Okay, we've got this beautiful bass sound. We're going to do a little bit of EQ to help shape it, and then we are going to do some of that lovely multiband saturation I mentioned just a second ago. So we've got some EQ on there. Let's do the multiband saturation. We're going to go for Saturn with this because it's a really good plugin because you can put these bands on it like this. So we want to make a band here, and this is the fundamental frequency where round about. So that's what we want to accentuate. That'll make the bass punch through the mix without overloading the whole frequency range with a little bit too much saturation. So let's get a bit of tube saturation on there. A cool little hack you can do on Saturn is you can create an envelope follower, link that to the drive, and then when the note hits, you'll get a little bit extra saturation. That's a nice little trick I like to use. So you can see how much more that is already punching through. So you can already hear without it, and then with it, punches through a lot more. And now, another thing, if you notice your bass has some notes that are sticking out that are louder than others, great time to put a little bit of compression on there. So let's do that now. So now with that compression, that bass is much more leveled out. Nice and smooth, which sounds awesome. And like I mentioned earlier, we're still getting that, inherent saturation from loading up an analog circuit that we can get with dedicated saturation plugins. So we've got a few little rounds of compression going on this bass to help it just sound all cohesive and glued into the mix. And another great place to use some saturation can be on the drum bus, where I love to use some tape saturation to really bring out the drums and help them sound really punchy and glue them together a little bit more. So let's try that out. So without that saturation, it sounds like this, and when we add it back in, a nice little extra crack to the snare. And that means we can actually turn the snare down and level a little bit and increase that crest factor further, like I mentioned earlier. Really important. Now, the last really cool place I like to use some saturation is on the mix bus itself. You can get that final bit of loudness that you need to get a really nice solid mix. So, we take this beat, I'm going to load up my master chain and show you how I like to use saturation on the mix bus. Okay, so I've just loaded up my master bus, which is going to make the whole track a lot louder and a lot punchier. And I just wanted to hone in on how I'm using saturation on the master bus. So I'm going to bypass my saturation plugins right now. Just so you know, I've got a nice sort of tubey saturation from the Saturn, and then this mix head is doing some nice tape saturation, and they both sound really nice. So let's give this a listen. And now if we activate those again, oh yeah. You can just hear that thickness, that punch, the density. Because it's creating more harmonics, it's making the whole mix sound more dense. And it's not necessarily making things much louder on the mix bus. It is a little bit, but that's not the main point. The main point is to lower that crest factor that I talked about earlier, so that when you're compressing, there's less difference between the peaks and the rest of the signal. So you can overall bring up the loudness in a much more smooth and natural way. So let's have one more bypass. And we'll activate them again. Really nice. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I hope you learned something from this video. One more tip I will give you is don't overdo it. It's very easy when you're new to saturation to be just whacking up a ton of saturation on everything. You end up making your mix really muddy. The mix knob is your friend. Just whack that mix knob down lower. I rarely, if I'm using Decapitator or Saturn, I will very rarely have the mix knob up at 100% because usually it's just a bit too much. You don't really need that much saturation, but you just want to saturate each element just a little bit, and then you'll get such a nice cohesive whole. Doing it at each stage of the process is incredibly helpful and will get you to a much better place overall. So thanks for watching, guys. See you next time. Love you guys. Peace.